Hello, join me to paint this beautiful cornflower in watercolor. I always start by wetting the paper, and this time I'm going to wet both sides of the paper. This is just to stretch the watercolor paper so it doesn't buckle or warp. Once it's placed flat onto the table or the surface, I can then wipe out or lift out extra water from the surface of the paper. Now let's start sketching. I'm using a graphite aquarelle pencil by Faber, which means it is really great for watercolors and it is water soluble. I really like the softness it gives, especially when my paper is damp. I really like the way I can work without much effort. And also I don't have to worry too much about having pencil lines sticking out in odd places, because this will eventually get washed out or blended into my watercolor washes. I think my sketch is complete. I'm going to start using watercolors now, and I'm going to start using cadmium yellow to begin with, a very light wash to begin with, and I'm going to go over the areas where I can see bright yellow petals. There are areas where there are pale petals as well, or rather white color petals, which I'm going to leave white at the moment. And for deeper areas, I'm going to use some burnt sienna as well. So you can see there's a little bit of burnt sienna on the tip of my brush as well. And I just like to drop in some pigment as I go along, just to get a soft touch for my petals. So you can see how the yellow and burnt sienna is slowly bleeding into each other. Next, I'm going to use a little bit of ultramarine blue just to catch the darker areas of the petals, and the best way to observe these are just to squint your eyes looking for shadows on the white colored petals. So I'm just going to place some ultramarine blue, as you can see here. My brush may have a little bit of burnt sienna as well, which is why the ultramarine blue is slightly muted down, which is okay to use a little bit of burnt sienna along with your ultramarine blue to get a very muted grey for the shadow areas. I'm going to continue working wet in wet, which means the paper is still wet, the pigment is still wet. I'm going to add more pigment on top. Like here, you can see how the pigment bleeds softly, not leaving any hard edges. So I have just given a darker shadow area to the center part of the flower, and this was simply ultramarine blue and burnt sienna getting me a very deep grey color. And this time I had used lesser water compared to the first washes that I've done, which is why you can see that the pigment sits comfortably on top of the previous pigments. And now let's fill in the outside areas with a little bit of green. The green that I'm using here is a mixture of sap green with a tiny bit of red or burnt sienna just to mute it down. I'm also going to keep the whole thing quite loose, which is why you can see I'm using a little bit of yellow as I go along, just giving the whole thing a quite loose outcome. So I'm continuing to add green on the outside of the flower. I'm changing the tone of the green every now and then. As you can see here, the green's gone a little bit deeper, which is simply because I added a tiny bit more red into the mixture. You can go back and forth with a little bit of bright green, a little bit of muted green, just to give it a sense of depth. I'm also going to add a few lines. Maybe you can add a few leaf-like structures if you like as well. It's completely up to you if you'd like to keep the background quite loose and flowy. Again, working wet in wet, I'm going to introduce a little bit of burnt sienna and cadmium yellow in the background, in the green area, and you can see how when I introduce the color, they sit comfortably well in the background because the paper is still wet, the paint is still wet, and there's no hard edges. And now I'm going to finish off with a little bit of spatters, again spattering into a wet area. You can see how the bright yellow just feathers out and gives you a very beautiful effect. That's first layer done. I'm going to let it dry completely, and once it's dry I can now begin to add a little bit more details into the flower. So I'm going to work on the cone of the coneflower, the center part of the coneflower, using the same mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. You can see how I get a very nice deep grey mixture. And this time I'm not using a lot of water, which means I have a lot of pigment in my mixture with little bit water. And I'm going to add, with a thinner brush, I'm going to add some dots, dashes, just bring in the texture of the center part of the flower. I can also use the same color to add some depth into the petals, especially the shadow areas. I'm also using some fresh burnt sienna along with the mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and you can see here how I'm trying to create texture in the center part of the flower. And it's always good to use a smaller brush, especially if you want to give finer details or if you want to do a texture study. Our flower is nearly done. I'm just going to finally give an extra depth to the background, which is deep green. So for this I'm using a mixture of sap green, a bit of red, any permanent red or crimson red is fine, and a touch of ultramarine blue for extra depth and shadow. and this has given me a very deep green, which I'd like to use in between the petals, as well as to give some leaf-like texture in the background. I hope you enjoyed watching my process video. If you'd like to paint with me, you can use the reference picture link that is given below in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.